Welcome back to another episode of the My Latin Life podcast. Since 2014, My Latin Life has been your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. Today, I have a guest. His name is Francisco Litvay. He's from Brazil and he specializes in flag theory and how free and special economic zones can help people with offshoring and internationalization. He's a perpetual traveler. He's opened multiple companies, lived on multiple continents. He's a dual citizen, overall man of the world. Francisco, how's it going, man?
All great, man. It's a wonderful day here in Sofia, Bulgaria. And yeah, what about you?
I'm doing well, doing well. Thanks for asking. So you're in Bulgaria, but you are a Brazilian.
Exactly. I'm from southern Brazil. The state is called Santa Catarina. Probably more known by its capital, Florianopolis, big expat hub nowadays.
It's really cool to see someone from Latin America who's involved in this flag theory stuff because I find that typically it's all the digital nomads, it's all the North Americans that are looking at Latin America and seeing all the tax benefits and everything. But you're a guy from Latin America and you're looking for ways to do things in your own region. And I feel like there's not enough of that. And so you're bringing these concepts to a Portuguese speaking audience with Settee. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that right and we'll come back to it. But I think it's really cool what you're doing overall.
Yeah, and I think it's a somewhat untapped market, right? If you look at the English speaking sphere, you just have so many content producers on digital nomadism and flag theory and offshoring and all these kinds of things. But when I started this company, like what 1 year and 9 months ago, so January last year, uh, there isn't really that much. There was like I think 3, 4 websites that were more on the open a US LLC or open a Panama account, but not that much on flag theory in general, right? So I think it's still a very much untapped market. Now there's some friends of mine who are also doing it in Spanish, called Libre Estado, so like for the Hispanic speakers. But
Hmm.
overall, it's a huge continent, and even though a lot of people from who are expats want to move down to Latin America, a lot of Latin Americans still have this idea that, oh man, I really want to go to Europe, I really want to go to the US, right? So they all have it in their minds that yeah, if I'm gonna make it, if I just go and live in Germany or something like that. So it's kind of an inverse market in that sense.
It's true. I feel like Latin Americans don't realize what they have on their doorstep because when I look at Central Americans, people from Costa Rica, Panama, Honduras, all that type of stuff, I don't see it like I'm not sure if they're taking advantage of the territorial tax systems the way that the digital nomads are in those countries.
Yeah, that's true, right? Most people are just focusing on servicing their own local economy. And that's the thing you do not want to do in a territorial tax country, right? Because then you're going to be taxed at the local income tax rates. And then it's no longer a tax haven. So it's it's just funny because you have to it's been a process that we've been kind of like educating our audience for some time, because when we would mention things like, yeah, you should go to get your residency in Paraguay, when we say that to a Brazilian, immediately the reaction is kind of like, what you're talking about, like Paraguay is poorer than Brazil, why would I go there, right? But they don't know about the tax advantages and how
Hmm.
you can get a permanent residency super easy, and you don't really have to be there afterwards. So it's perfect for a digital nomad.
It's true. So, for the audience listening, in this episode, we're going to get a lot into talking about different aspects of flag theory, different aspects of how you can internationalize your life. We'll talk in detail about some of the countries that we have additional knowledge on that we think we can share some information, and we're going to talk about a lot of that stuff. So, I think we'll bounce around a bit. But Francisco, I wanted to get a little bit more of your background. I was honestly just curious because you're a young guy, and typically you don't see someone so young that's really leading the charge on these things. And I was curious how this all came about for you.
My How I got into this field was actually through free private cities. Big debt I have to Titus Gable and that whole field. So like in high school, I was a libertarian, and I think that's something you have a lot in Brazil. Like you have a lot of libertarians in Brazil when compared to most other Latin American countries. and I got into this concept of free cities and private governance and all of these things. And I went to study in Austria. I have a Austrian dual citizenship because of my grandpa. And when I was there, I got a job offer basically to work there. And I applied, I got it. I started then networking into this German speaking libertarian circles, And there I met Christoph Heuermann, who was also an ambassador to the Free Private Cities Foundation. And he, for those who are listening who don't know him, he founded Staatenlos, which is the biggest brand for flag theory in German. And he's crazy perpetual traveler, right? He's been, I think, to 190 something countries by now. And
Hmm.
so, like, since 2020, I've been just devouring everything that I can find on flag theory and nomadism and traveling and taxes. And then, yeah, early last year, we decided to partner up and start offering these same things for the Portuguese speaking market.
That's really cool to see that you have that background with Stautenlos. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about what this group is, because I know they're extremely influential. We talked a little bit about it in my episode with Ramon, aka RG, which I think was episode 9 or 10. Who was he's a Swiss guy that was very influenced by this German language Stautenlos organization. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about it.
Yeah, so Staatenlos is a franchise by now, right? It's already in 6 languages, but it's focused on flag theory, consulting, and it was in the beginning to help Germans and Austrians and Swiss optimize their taxes and leave their tax system and go to tax havens, all of these kinds of things. And by now, it already has a lot of different branches to it, right? Like we also have a big international insurance branch. There's also Chris even bought a catamaran where he's chartering like for nomads as well. So it's now it's a bunch of different projects under this one brand. But it's at its core, it's a consulting and infomercial business for in the flag theory space.
And so, what do they do exactly? Like, what services do they provide? You mentioned insurance. Obviously, they share information, and I know they have a really popular Facebook group. What else do they do?
I mean, I would say the main service that they offer, and we also offer in Portuguese, is the consultancy, right? Where we basically get a detailed overview of the personal situation of the client, right? Like his citizenship, his profession, what source of income he has, what are his objectives, what are his life plans, and then see how we can craft a flag theory plan around it, right? Like what citizenships would make sense, what residencies would make sense, what companies would make sense given the residency options that he's considering, and how these things, affect each other, right? Because, for example, the company part, you can't just go opening a company anywhere. Like if you live in the European Union, for example, there's a lot of restrictions on having companies in tax havens, for example.
Hmm.
So, really need to know how these things affect each other.
It does seem though that the German market this works really well for, and I've definitely seen lots of Germans, Swiss, and Australians or Austrians rather kind of take advantage of different systems, move to Latin America, get set up, get tax residency in Latin America, and successfully leave Europe.
Yeah, because these two countries, Austria and Germany, and actually Brazil as well, has this advantage that they have a system where you can do like uh, this, they call it Abmeldung in German, which is the like deregistration kind of like you can get out of their tax net without becoming a tax resident somewhere else, right? In most other countries, you generally need to show that you have a new residency before they will let you off the hook, right? So if you're a Portuguese, for example, you need to show a new tax ID in a new jurisdiction so that Portugal will stop taxing you. But not for Germany, not for Austria, not for Brazil. You can just leave and say, "Hey, I've departed. I'm no longer living here. Leave me alone." Right, and they'll do it. So while Germany and Austria are tax hells, right? They have very terrible taxes and a lot of like terrible regulations for doing business inside the country, it's very easy to leave. So that makes it
For
quite a good
now.
place to start as a nomad.
For
Yeah.
now. And tell us a little bit more about Statenlos. And the reason I ask is because I just know it's very influential. And I think that sort of like the next generation of internationalizers and flag theory people, I think a lot of them are going to come out of Statenlos. Would you agree with that? And how do you trace sort of like the intellectual line of thinking from like who influenced Statenlos, who influenced the founder, and then how is his influence being felt now that they've been around a number of years and the next generation's coming out?
Oh man, that's like an academic historian question. Oh,
A
the
little bit, because who else is going to give us the history of this stuff? You know.
yeah, like the from Staatenlos, at least from what I've talked to Chris, he's been influenced a lot by the, let's say, OGs of remote work and digital nomadism, like Tim Ferriss, and also the I think it was like Schultz, his name, the guy who first coined the three flag
Howard Schultz.
theory. Yeah. And the guy who first coined the three flag theory, and then the other one, I think Heiji Hill or something like
Hmm.
that, for the five flag theory.
Hmm.
Then other guys who were, starting early in the space, like Doug Casey. And then nowadays we also have like a lot of really good connections to other people in the space, like for example Mikkel from Expat Money, good friend of
Hmm.
ours. So it's there's a lot of idea exchanges somehow in this space. A lot of people talking to each other, which is good. I think it's there's a lot of agencies and companies that try to keep info more for themselves. So it's really nice to see a lot of people just sharing and publishing a lot of alpha online.
Yeah, I think it's pretty new, this idea that most people are starting to give away the secrets, because I think even a couple of years ago it was very difficult to get a lot of this information.
Yeah, that's true. And like the offshore space, when you're talking about like foundations and trusts and private banking, and so it is kind of shrouded in mystery, right? Like you have a lot of these myths of oh, I'm gonna get a Swiss bank account and it's gonna be a number the account and no one's gonna know who the owner is, and in reality, Switzerland actually exchanges banking info. So if you want privacy, it's counterintuitive, but you go to Paraguay, you go to São Tome, you go to Honduras, countries that are not in the CRS, countries that don't exchange info multilaterally. So
Hmm.
it's also breaking a lot of these myths, these established truths or like half truths, and sharing a lot of these things that are just under the radar, right? Like a lot of people just don't know that some countries can act as tax havens or can act as privacy havens.
Yeah, and I we'll definitely circle back to a list of countries that you wouldn't normally think about that actually have some really cool stuff. I think the non-dom stuff is very cool. Of course, the special economic zones are cool, the territorial tax. So we'll definitely come back to that. Um, Tell me a little bit more about Settee. So this is your project for the Portuguese-speaking market that is inspired by Statenlos. It's spelled Settee. Um, so you founded this project, right?
Yeah, so here's the business idea. Get the pitch. I was talking to Chris, and he said, like I was looking at his websites, and he already had a website in German, in English, in Spanish, in French, in Russian, and I was looking at like, Chris, why don't you have a website in Portuguese as well, man? It's 200 million Brazilians, and a lot of them want to leave. And whenever there's elections, a lot of them are panicking and thinking, "Look, oh my God, I need to find a plan B." And he just tells me like, you know, so far there was one guy that wanted to execute on that idea, but he didn't move forward. And since we know each other and like we already have a relationship, you can go ahead, you can try it. So we worked out the details of this franchise agreement where they would provide the content and we would provide some commissions from them for providing like the ebooks and the blog articles which we translated. And then I reached out to another guy called Rafael Lima. If you're Brazilian, you probably know him from the YouTube channel Ideias Radicais. It's like, I think, the biggest libertarian channel in the world by now. It's like 600,000 subscribers, something. So, or second biggest, something like that.
Okay.
But then I talked to him like, Rafael, we already knew each other for some years already as well. I was like, dude, there's this business idea, there's this content here. Like, I see that there's not really that much competition in the Portuguese speaking realm. But also what I knew from Christoph is that he started in 2015, something like that, and he had to grind a lot, right? Like, he spent years just writing articles and engaging with the community and all of these things before he got any real traction. Right nowadays, he does a lot of consultings. Like, every day has multiple consultings, but during the early stage, it's something that really takes a lot of time, so you can get some credibility, to get some reputation, to get the business going, right? And then I had the idea to partner with Rafael, who already has an established name, who already has an established brand, and like kind of co-branded with his channel.
Hmm.
So that was the idea for the launch and how to make it. We the story of how we launched was also quite fun, because we already had an agreement. Okay, that's how we're going to do it, and we're already creating the website and the systems and everything. And then this was, I think, March of last year, March 2021. And then comes this news that Lula, the previous president, who was actually convicted of corruption and went to jail and all of these things, that the Supreme Court had kind of annulled his condemnation so that he could run again for president. And Rafa reached out to me that day and he said, "Can we launch today?" I was like, the website is, there's still a lot of things that need work on, but like the checkout is working, and the contact form is working. And he was like, "All right, let's do this." We did the launch with a video and everything like that. And there was just so much outrage, so much like, how can this possibly be happening, that we got something like 1,000 emails in 3 days.
Wow.
And we had like two people to answer the emails. Like, it was complete shutdown. Like, we had to write on all social media like, "Hey guys, we're gonna answer everyone, please just give us a moment, we're a bit overloaded here." We had to bring in additional people, so that was quite fun timing as well. But yeah, that's the main gist of it. We help Brazilians and also Portuguese people move abroad and get second citizenships and pay less taxes. Also very important.
Yeah, that's awesome. Um, yeah, there's so many directions we could take this conversation, but yeah, I guess let's just start with that. I mean, so what would you recommend to a Brazilian who engages your guys' services? Obviously, it's going to depend a little bit on some of the specifics of their situation, but do you find that there's a couple key pieces of infrastructure that are that work well for most Brazilians?
hmm Yeah, here we have to distinguish, right? Because there is two main kinds of clients we get. There's the client that, man, I love Brazil. Like, lifestyle here, quality of life here is unbeatable. I have beach, I have barbecue, I have everything I want, but we don't want to pay so much tax. And there's the people who actually want to leave, right? For the people who want to stay, there are a couple things that you can mention. First, Brazil has a number of special regimes for companies, right? Normal companies in Brazil pay a shit ton of tax, but if you're in the simplified regime, which is up to 4.8 million reais turnover, so like something like almost $1 million turnover per year, you can a lot of times stay with quite a decent amount of tax, like between like 6 and 20% for most self-employed solo entrepreneurs. And that's like tax on turnover. And then when you distribute dividends, there's no tax on internal dividends in Brazil, so that's a nice feature. And if you're bigger than that, or if the simplified regime is not making sense that much, they also have a special regime called lucro presumido, which is like you get taxed on the presumed profit. So they apply some rates to determine what would be the presumed
Hmm.
profit of your field of business. And then like if you're doing services, in many cases you can end up with like 15% tax total, which is still quite good if you compare to like Western Europe, in most countries there.
Hmm.
And that's on the inside, I guess. Like that's within the Brazilian system. We can also mention that currently Brazil doesn't really have CFC rules, like controlled foreign company rules for individuals. So it's still quite easy to just live in Brazil and own a holding company in the Bahamas or in Panama or in whatever tax haven you choose. And then as long as you don't distribute money to yourself, that's tax free, right? So you can invest abroad in crypto, in stocks, or whatever you want. As long as you keep that outside of Brazil, you don't bring it home. It's not going to get taxed. So you can like compound your investments abroad tax free quite easily. And then when you leave, there's no exit tax either at the moment. So if you ever exit Brazil, they're not taking a cut of it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think anyone that's listening, maybe they're not interested in, maybe they're not Brazilian or they're not interested in living in Brazil, but a lot of what might apply in Brazil, there'd be sort of like the theory can be reapplied elsewhere. So anyone listening that's not interested in the particular country that we're discussing, just know that a lot of the theories will apply to other countries as well, and other countries have economic zones. Other countries have like interesting incentives for new companies and things like that. So everything can often be reapplied, or you can use this lens and use the same lens elsewhere. I think that's probably worth mentioning.
Oh yeah, for sure. And here we can give a lot of examples, even within Latin America, right? So Brazil has these free zones and export processing zones as well, but that's something you have in basically all of Latin America. So if you go to Uruguay, for example, and you open a free zone company there, it's going to be completely tax free as long as you don't sell within Uruguay. So if your clients are abroad, you have 0% tax on your profit and 0% tax on your dividends. Congratulations. And like even in the bigger countries that don't have a territorial tax regime, like Brazil, like Colombia, like Mexico, you still have these simplified regimes for small companies under a certain turnover, right? So in Colombia you have this simple regime, which is like until I think $850,000 turnover per year, and then you pay like between 1.8 and 11.6, I think, percent tax on your turnover, right? So for local service business, or for just doing uh, as a self-employed, basically. And same thing in Mexico, right? You have like this régimen simplificado de confianza, which is I think between something like 1.5 and 2.5% tax, up to 180K dollars turnover per year. So whenever you're going to a country that you're planning on staying a longer term for, check out if they have some special economic zones, zonas francas, any of those names, and check out if they have any simplified regimes for small companies under a certain turnover. Generally, you can get good conditions in there. What mostly where you get screwed up is if you're a mid-sized business and you can't benefit from the big companies regime and the free zones, nor
Hmm.
the simplified regimes for the smaller companies, right? So if you're really big or if you're still small, you can generally get some good conditions. But if you're in the middle, then that's not really the best place to be in most cases.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. I have another personal misconception that I wanted to share, and you could help kind of break it down. And that is sort of my misconception that these things need to be in some way physical businesses. Because I'm thinking, okay, special economic zones, there's typically a port, and they sort of like section off a little like port land of the country and say that's the special economic zone. I guess that's not always the case, but I think often is. In Colombia, or sorry, in Panama, that's the case. And so I'm thinking about ports and I'm thinking about physical businesses, but I assume the business doesn't have to do anything physical at all, right? It could always just be like a ebook company, or whatever sort of online company, and take advantage of these special economic zone incentives, right?
Okay, so that depends, right? That depends on the jurisdiction you're at. Zones can take many shapes and sizes. Sometimes you have like free ports, which is more for logistics and import export. You have these export processing zones, which are more like industrial parks. You have zones for like energy production. You have zones for like really manufacturing intensive things. But you also have zones which are business parks, for example, right? So the World Trade Center in Montevideo is a free zone, or you also have like a lot of these business parks in Honduras. So it depends on the place, on the jurisdiction. For example, Brazil, until last year, until the reform of the export processing zone regime, they only allowed production businesses, right? So in that case, yeah, you needed to be exporting something physical. Now they also allow service businesses as well. So you can also, just be doing, I don't know, some kind of service export, like IT services to clients abroad.
Hmm.
One thing you have to note for special economic zones, though, is that they generally have some kind of like local substance requirement that the work has to be done from inside the zone, right? So you actually need an office there. You actually need to have at least one employee working there. That's at least the rule for Uruguay, for example. At least one person working within
Hmm.
an office inside the zone.
Hmm.
And depending on where you're at, it's more. Depending on where you're at, maybe you don't even need any employees. So that's something that varies but from country to country.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit more about special economic zones, and then we'll kind of move on and talk about territorial tax. We'll talk about birth tourism. We'll talk about non-dom status and a couple different popular countries. But let's double down on special economic zones for a minute. So I think through something I read through your profiles, there's over 5,000 special economic zones now across 170 countries.
Yeah, so the number depends on how you want to count it, right? Like we created this map called the Open Zone Map at the Adrianople Group, another company that I'm involved in. And there we mapped 5,500 zones across over 70 countries. But this was counting like more like major zones, but if you were to count single factory zones like the Latin American maquilas, which is basically like you can have a single building be a special economic zone, right? Like you have
Hmm.
this one uh, this one building be a zone with tax incentives, and once you exit the building, it's not a free zone. uh, and if you count like PO box zones like you have in the United States, where you don't really have a physical location, it's just it's just like a zip code, then you can have like over 12,000 zones worldwide. So we use like 5,500 for major zones that actually have a physical location where you can have multiple companies um, inside it, right? It's not just a single factory that is a special economic zone.
It's just so crazy, man, because these special economic zones, uh, they have the ability to create laws. Oftentimes, they have significant autonomy from the federal government, and you have 5,000 plus of these zones all around the world that basically operate to some extent autonomous from their countries, and it's just a lot to keep track of at the global level, because you just have all these like new moving parts. You thought, people thought they only had 200 countries to manage and whatever, but now you have all these economic zones, and it's there's just so many additional variables, so many opportunities. Obviously this seems to be growing a lot.
Yeah, I don't think it's something that like one person or one company can keep track of. Like it's impossible. Some countries have multiple zone regimes at the same time. So right, Brazil, for example, has a free zone regime and an export processing zone regime, and they're not the same. They have different tax incentives. They have different regulations. So you're not going to be able to keep track of everything, but you can be aware and follow some of the most prominent, some of the most interesting, right? Like for example, the zones in Madeira or the UAE, which are very famous, or the ZEDEs in Honduras, which also got a lot of traction. So yeah, like you can keep track of the more interesting ones, because a lot of these like are just simple export processing zones or free trade zones, which is, oh yeah, you're not going to pay import and export tariffs, right? That's the majority of them, which have
Yeah.
some light regulatory, tax, labor law benefits. But you do have some of them, and at least over 100, where you have some real regulatory changes or freedoms that, for example, like you can try medical things that are not allowed in the rest of the country, or people can enter that part of the country visa free, while the rest you still have to have to get a normal visa.
See,
So
that's crazy. That's crazy. Yeah, so why don't you outline for us these special economic zones? What are some of the most common privileges that they have over the traditional regime, and some of the crazy things where they have the ability to make laws, they can do potentially their own visa rules and immigration rules. Talk to us a bit about what these special economic zones entail.
all right. So if we're talking the more common benefits, we can mention, for example, reductions or completely cutting off taxes, like corporate taxes on the profits. You can get lower taxes on withholdings, right? So when you're distributing dividends or royalties or interest to other countries. So, for example, in Portugal, when you try to distribute dividends normally, you have 28% that is withheld at source. Sorry, 25. And when you distribute it from the Madeira free zone, it's zero, right? So you have a lot of these tax benefits. Sometimes you have easier or faster regulations for bringing in foreign workers, or for getting yourself a known visa. So for example, in the UAE, if you open a free zone company, you can sponsor your own visa as the company owner, right? So you just have to open the company, then you can get a 3-year visa, and you can even bring in your family, right? You can bring dependents there as well. So opens up immigration options to that
Hmm.
country without having
Hmm.
to do like a substantial investment. You just have to open a company and keep it running with an active license. What else? You can get some currency simplifications, so that you have free convertibility of currency. That's something you do not have in every country. You can get better infrastructure sometimes. So generally, these zones are in industrial or business parks. So they also get benefits like cheaper electricity or just more reliable and faster
Mm.
internet. So for people with logistical or infrastructure concerns, these are generally the best equipped places to do business within a given country. And if you want to go on the more crazy side of things, so for example, China made the entire island of Hainan a special economic zone. And for Hainan, you can go in visa free for 30 days. If you're from one of the, I think, 60 something nationalities that was allowed. So
Hmm.
that's very impressive, right? It's not impressive for most of the countries where you can just go in 90 days visa free, but for China, where basically everyone needs to get a visa, that's actually a big improvement, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And in some countries, you also have some more regulatory freedom. So, for example, now in the Brazilian export processing zone, since the last reform from last year, you can operate using the regulatory code of the countries that you're exporting products or services to, right? So if you don't want to use the Brazilian regulatory system because you think it's too bureaucratic, too complicated to use, then if you're exporting services to an American company, you can just use the regulatory code of the US to operate. So that's a big advantage, for example. Or you can use arbitration instead of the standard courts in the country. You have a lot of these zones with good arbitration panels, like the Dubai zones, the Dubai courts. You have also in Abu Dhabi, the Abu Dhabi International Financial Center. You have it in Kazakhstan, for example. They also created this common law arbitration center in Astana, the capital. So just for resolving disputes faster, cheaper, and with just overall a more business friendly rule set. And yeah, if you want to look at the ones that have a lot of regulatory freedom, you can look, for example, in Honduras with this ZEDE regime. For example, Prosper is the most well known one, although you have three of these zones in total, where they're subject to the Constitution of Honduras, they're subject to the Honduran constitutional law, and they're subject to the Honduran to the criminal law and to the international treaties, right? So they have to respect any human rights treaties. But besides that, they can create all of their business law, and it's like they're their own municipality, right? But with a lot more autonomy. They can basically create all of the rules except for criminal law, and they can't go against the constitution. But besides that, you have complete freedom. So these guys, for example, in Prospera, are operating under a common law regulatory code that they
Hmm.
built, like just taking the best practices from the US and from New Zealand and from the UK. And that makes it way faster and cheaper and simpler to do business, or even get a building permit, that kind of thing. So that's also really awesome.
Yeah, this Prospera project seems really interesting. So this is in Honduras, I think primarily on the island of Roatan. Did they carve out a physical part of the island, or is it the whole island?
Yeah, it's a part of the island that is the Zeddy at the moment. It's not something that is like, there's fences and they're carving out something that is to be completely excluded from the local population. No, they're actually, they interact a lot with the people in Roatan, and they do a lot of actions there. So props to them. But the way the Zeddy regime works is that anyone who has a private plot of land can ask to be annexed to one of the existing Zeddies, right? So, like if you have a big plot that is neighboring Prospera, you can, hey, I would like to be under their regulatory system. You can send them a petition, and if they approve it, you can be part of the zone. So they put this mechanism which is very organic for growth, right? Which is something that it is a best practice, right? If you see a lot of these special economic zones, the way the government created the system for these zones to be established, something like, oh yeah, the federal government is going to designate the zones that it thinks are, that should have a special economic zone, and then it's generally in the middle of nowhere, where it's super poor and there is horrible logistics, but the government sees that, oh, this is a zone that is not really well developed, so we're going to put a zone to develop it. But sometimes these places are less developed because it's just logistically impossible to do business well. And when you have these countries that are more flexible in establishing zones, then generally you get more success as well.
Hmm. So what are they doing in Roatan specifically? Who's behind that project, and what's their vision?
So this is probably someone you should also bring to the podcast as well. I think they would be very open to that conversation. But Prospera is run by an American company called Prospera Incorporated. I don't remember the state they're in. I think maybe Texas or something like that. But in any case, an American company. And they're creating this platform basically to do business. They have this e-residence platform. They're already also doing a lot of real estate development there with these like Duna residencies, which are apartments for co-working and so on. So they're focusing a lot more on the expat side, on the nomad side, on the international service providing side, right? So they're doing a lot of focus on this, like getting local Hondurans to provide services to companies and people in the US and Europe. Right, so they're more geared on the services, tourism, nomad space. Whereas, for example, if you look at Ciudad Morazan, which is another ZEDE in the mainland, uh, they are already much more focused on blue collar work, right? Like they're bringing in factories, and their focus is much more on, yeah, we're going to create this safe city. Our main value prop is security and a place where you can work and have a job, right? So you already see two of these zones that have completely different value propositions, and both are running now.
I mean, sounds good to me, man. Safer, lower electricity, lower taxes. The benefits keep going. And I thought it'd be cool to read off some more of these. But before I do, I wanted to clarify a term you're using. You're saying ZE, so like zona economica, or what's that term you're using?
Oh yeah, so that is the name of the special economic zone regime they have in Honduras. It's called Zona de Empleo y Desarrollo Económico, which is like zone for
Okay.
employment and economic development, right?
Okay. ZEEE.
ZEDE,
Gotcha.
ZEDE. Yeah.
Zeddy, Zeddy. Cool. And then you have like the Zona Franca in Barcelona. There's Le Verdun free zone in Bordeaux, France. I'll read a couple more because I think it's funny. The Kaunas free zone in what country is this? Lithuania. Hainan. We got, I saw Katowice. What country is this?
Katowice, yeah, the one in Poland.
Poland.
Mhm. Inside
Um,
the European Union, you have mostly just free zones, right? Like you don't have these more advanced kind of like charter cities or these kind of things. It's mostly just free zones. It's these ports for import and export, with the exception of the Canaries and Madeira, where you actually have some more uh, nice
yeah,
cities.
that's interesting. I don't. Another one. This is my favorite one. Is the Gizak Economic Zone in Uzbekistan. So if you want to set up in Uzbekistan, make sure you're going to the Gizak Free Economic Zone. Gizzakh. And so there's just unlimited of these. Makassar Free Zone. Where is this, man? On the Indonesian island of Sulawesi. Like, how can you keep track of all these things? Every Indonesian island has its own free zone. There's like 5,000 islands. There's just so many. Sorry, I'm getting
Like that
sidetracked, but
map took around 2 years to make, and it was like 40 people working on the project. It was quite a task.
it's insane. Coyol free zone in Costa Rica. I haven't even heard a lot of these Latin American ones. That's crazy. So basically, long story short, it seems like basically every country is a free zone. One thing that's cool about it for Europeans, as you were kind of alluding to, is in Europe, there's not a lot of opportunities to stay in Europe and reduce your taxes significantly. Obviously, there's a few people know about things like Bulgaria, where you are, Portugal, the islands as you mentioned, but it's very difficult to sort of move to a territorial tax hub or a really good tax base and stay in Europe. And I think these free economic zones or special economic zones, that seems to be the path forward for a lot of Europeans that want to stay based in Europe and take advantage of some of the programs out there.
Yeah, because when you're living in Europe, when you're in, and by Europe I mean like the European Union, right? If you're in Georgia, that's a territorial tax country too. It's more relaxed. But if you're in the European Union, then what generally makes the most sense is to have another company inside the European Union, right? That's where you get the least stress with the financial authorities and the haciendas and all of
Hmm.
these things. And then inside the EU, the special economic zones of Portugal and Spain are some of the most tax competitive companies you can get, right? In Madeira, you have like 5% corporate tax. And in the Canaries, you have 4% corporate tax. So that's very low, right? You only get less than that if you're in Romania, for example, where you have 1% tax on turnover, but that's only until 500K turnover per year, right, under micro companies regime. Technically, you can have three micro companies, so it's 1.5 million. But after that, you're limited, right? It's for small, mid-sized. Whereas in Madeira and in Spain, you can have a bigger turnover than that.
And so, how would something like that work in Madeira or in the Canary Islands? Is there a physical presence requirement? How can Europeans go get set up on the islands? Maybe they want to live there, enjoy some good weather, or they just want to set up a base. What are some of the detailed aspects of that?
hmm So, in terms of like personal taxes, there's not really much of a difference in going to Canaries or going to Madeira in comparison to their mainlands. What you have really that is special there is the companies regime, right? Like in these special economic zones, you can get very low tax companies. So, in terms of moving, you can just move to Spain or Portugal, just like mainland or the islands, not going to make too much of a difference. And then if you're European, you already can move out of the European Union Freedom of Movement Agreement. But if you're not, Portugal has a lot of visa options. We can talk about that later. And then in terms of the companies, there are some requirements to establish them. Madeira is a bit easier. You have to have at least one local employee receiving a Portuguese minimum salary, which is around like 700 something euros last time I checked. And you also have to invest 75,000 euros in the company within the first, I think, 2 years of business. And
Hmm.
then in the Canary Islands, it's a bit more restrictive. You have to have either 5 employees if you're in the main islands of Tenerife and Gran Canaria, or 3 employees if you're in the smaller islands, and invest between 50 to 100K, depending if you're in the main islands or the small islands. So
Right.
generally, Madeira is easier to set up. And then, yeah, you have 5% corporate tax and no withholdings on the dividends if you don't live in Portugal or a tax haven country, according to Portugal.
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, it sounds like for a lot of people, it could be a no-brainer. I mean, 75K investment, hire some guy for 700 bucks a month, call it 10K a year, really not a big deal. And then you get to take advantage of this regime under which you can pay 5% instead of whatever 30% you were paying back in France or something like that. So it seems like it's a no-brainer for it could be for a lot of situations. What do you see as some of the most common situations for people who are setting up in these free zones? Do you find that they are are they starting new businesses, or are they starting sort of branch offices of existing businesses? Are they people who are moving sort of within their own country, or are they sort of sidestepping to other countries, uh, in the European Union or internationally? What are you kind of seeing there in terms of the type of people that this attracts and works best for?
Mhm. So Madeira at the moment is doing a lot to try to attract startups. So I've already talked to some Brazilians, for example, that went into accelerator programs to get into Madeira, right? So that's something that they're trying to do. But you have a lot of different businesses there, right? Like outsourcing, service businesses, even import export services. Just it's also a free port. So if you're doing something with physical products, it's also a possibility. It doesn't make too much sense though if you're living in Portugal to have a Madeira company, or if you're living in Spain to have a Canaries company, because then the dividends are taxed at the normal Portuguese slash Spanish rates, right? So these really are they're a better tax option if you're not living in their country, right? So if you live, for example, in Cyprus and then you have a Madeira company, or if you're living, in Brazil or Georgia or somewhere else, and then you have a Madeira company, than if you're living in Portugal itself, right? So it's generally more on the people that are somewhere else in Europe, and then they have this special economic zone company in one of the islands.
Makes sense. And do you find that these economic zones, like I imagine, because it's just so new, that they're going to be changing a lot. They're going to be changing their rules to conform to their systems or to attract people, etc. So it seems like there might be a bit of a risk that it just could be less stable, in terms of, sort of predicting where things are going to be in a couple years in terms of hiring laws and taxes and this and that. Do you find, are people like locking in particular agreements, or do they have to just say like, look, I'm attaching myself to this economic zone, and whatever they go with, I gotta adapt to that? Or can they sort of like get it on paper and say, okay, we're gonna maintain this 5% tax rate for 10 years or something?
Mhm. That is a great point that you brought up, because this is there's both upsides and downsides to being in a zone in terms of the like in just in terms of legal certainty, right? A lot of these zones have better rules than the rest of their country in terms of, for example, in Uruguay, it says that even if the zone law is repealed, or if there is a change to the tax benefits, that the companies in the zones are still like they're grandfathered in for 25 years, right? That you still get to keep the original benefits. Of course,
Hmm.
then if it's a country that there is zero trust in the country, right? Like, I don't know, some very, very low rule of law, then yeah, maybe they go against what they said and you still have to pay taxes anyway. That's not something you expect out of Uruguay, though. It's like one of the more stable, higher rule of law countries in LATAM. So, generally you have more legal security in the zone than with normal companies in the country. That's for sure. But at the same time, a lot of countries do have these temporary benefits, right? So it's not forever. In the case of Madeira, for example, they have their special status officially approved by the European Union until 2027. And then after that, it's supposed to end, and you're going to just pay like a normal Portuguese company. So, they kind of attract you and they kind of lock you in. You already did this big investment and you already have an accounting company and you already paid the money to incorporate it and went through all the bureaucracy. Then maybe by 2027, when the incentives end, then you don't want to relocate again, right? So you do have
Yeah.
a lot of zones that have temporary tax benefits. And if I remember correctly, Costa Rica is the same, right? They have some benefits for like 5 or 10 years, and then they're gone.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we'll move on because I don't want to spend the whole episode on special economic zones because it's just an insane can of worms. But it's a topic that it's nice to know that you're an expert on, and we'll continue to support each other in the future and talk about it. And maybe I'll get some more people on to talk specifically about it. Maybe I can get the Prospera guys as well. So lots of good ideas there. So that's special economic zones. Maybe next, let's talk about, I guess, the most standard form of this, which is territorial tax systems. And that's something that we've talked a lot about on Twitter, you and I, and we've each done lots of threads and try to educate people about this. So, could you explain the significance of a territorial tax system and how someone could reduce their taxes potentially by switching to a territorial tax residency?
Sure. So let's get to the basics first. Territorial tax system, or just the principle of territoriality, is that a country taxes what is considered to be locally sourced income, and it does not tax what is considered to be foreign sourced income. So let's say that all your revenues come from Panama, and you are a Panamanian. Then and you're living in Panama, and then if you have this income, it's going to be considered locally sourced income. You're going to pay income tax normally. But then if you move to Costa Rica, or if you move to Nicaragua, or basically anywhere in Central America, they also have a territorial tax system. So there, the income is considered to be foreign sourced, and then it's not going to be taxed. And because there are enough territorial tax countries that you have a lot of options to choose from. There's always a place you could go where your income is not going to be considered to be locally sourced. So you can potentially reduce your taxes to zero, like this. So that's the easiest trick used by digital nomads or expats, right? Like, oh, you have your clients in the US, you move to Panama, and then you have like a US LLC which distributes you these profits, which are then tax free in Panama, right? So like that's becoming tax free 101. That's the basics of territorial tax system. Of course, then there's also like the nuances of what is really considered to be local sourced income, what is foreign sourced income. Some countries vary on that, and there's a lot of specificities that we could go into.
Yeah. I actually wouldn't mind knowing that because I don't know where some of that gray area is. So where are the gotchas around uh determining what's locally sourced versus internationally sourced or foreign sourced?
Okay, so generally speaking, things like local rents, local capital gains, local salaries, local self employment income is considered to be locally sourced income, right? So, in a territorial tax country, if you're receiving a salary from your own company, let's say, even if the company is abroad, in a lot of cases, the salary is considered to be a source of local income because it implies that you're doing work, right? That you're doing work
Right.
from this.
If you get paid to a bank account locally, I guess.
That depends again, but the point is like a salary is considered to be like an active kind of income where it implies that you're doing local work, right? Whereas, for example, dividends, basically everywhere, they're always considered to be foreign sourced income in like almost all countries. So income sources that are more passive, like dividends, like royalties, like interest, like pensions, these kind of things, they're almost always considered to be foreign sourced. Where salary and self-employment income, a lot of times they are considered to be local sourced, even if you're providing services to clients abroad, right? So if you're in Uruguay and you register as self-employed and you're providing services to a company in, I don't know, Argentina, since the work is being done in Uruguay, like, and the income is coming from self-employment, then you're going to be taxed still. But if you had, for example, a foreign company distributing you dividends, then that's a different situation.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned that it's important where you do the work and where the work is performed, because I think that's what can get digital nomads caught up specifically, where let's say you know they're getting paid to a Dubai company. Everything's going through Dubai, but they're performing the work, or they're like living in Germany, or they're living in XYZ country. Let's just say they're living in another territorial tax country. They're living in Panama and they're performing the work, and they're living there year round. I see a lot of room for gray area there in interpretation by tax authorities to say, well, look, you perform the work in our country more than 6 months of the year. So technically, it should be locally sourced. And I think that right now, people aren't smart about it in terms of all the participants in the system. But I think eventually, over time, I think there's going to be an increased emphasis on where the work is performed and using that as sort of a vector.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think, and you already have some countries that pay more attention to it and mention it explicitly, right? So Uruguay is one of them. Hong Kong and Singapore also, they have this territorial principle for their companies, but they apply the same thing, right? Like, where was the work done? If it was done from Hong Kong, even if to a foreign client, then it's still, locally sourced. So that's something you have to pay attention to. Some countries, like for example Panama, is very relaxed about this. They mention that anything that comes from a foreign paying source, that's foreign. So that's more relaxed. But you have to be aware of these distinctions, and you also have to be aware of, it's not always that the territorial system applies forever or for everyone. So for example, Philippines is a country that is territorial for expats but not for locals. I imagine there's
Mhm.
probably not many Filipinos listening here, but these distinctions can apply. And you also have countries that are territorial for some time, right? Like Chile is territorial for the first 3 years of you staying there. Dominican Republic, depending on the visa you get, it's forever. But if you get on the wrong visas, it's only 2 years of territorial system. New Zealand, you have that for like 4 years as well. So a lot of these are temporary programs and not forever. So be mindful that you don't get locked into a country that after some time is gonna tax you on everything you have.
Hmm. And I think we're speaking at a decently advanced level, or at least we have sort of an assumed understanding of what these things are. Um, but maybe for someone who's new to some of these concepts, could you break down the difference between residency based taxation, territorial based taxation, and then citizenship based taxation?
Sure. So residence based taxation is what you have in most of the world, which is if you are a tax resident in the country, which generally means like you have your center of life interest there, or you spend over 183 days there, then you will be taxed on your worldwide income. That is the most common type of taxation. Then you have the territorial taxation, which we mentioned already. You're taxed on locally sourced income, but not on foreign sourced income. You have countries which have like this kind of in-betweener where it's actually residence based, but for some years you have a territorial system. And then you also have this citizenship based taxation, which you only have like fully in the US and Eritrea, where it doesn't matter where you go, you're still a tax resident.
And I remember I asked a Eritrean guy, cab driver, and I said, "Man, like you're under the same thing as the Americans. You're taxed on your worldwide income." And I think he said something like, he's like, "No, no, you don't have to pay anything. But if you want services in Eritrea, you want to get your birth certificate, then you're gonna have to pay and sort of get caught up in it. But you can just kind of not pay as long as you don't get services or you don't go back." Something like that.
I heard something that like if you still have family in Eritrea and you're not paying, then they threaten your family and they do a bit more shady kinds of things like human right violations.
Who knows? Anyway. So and so the big thing is that uh you're I'd say pretty much all European countries and Canada and where else but uh those are probably the big markets. Those are residency based taxation countries, right? So
Exactly.
Canada and Europe are residency based taxation countries. And if you are a resident, if you are a permanent resident, a tax resident, then you're going to be paying on your worldwide income. And so basically, what people are doing, what Statenlos uh, really started popularizing the idea of in Europe, is basically just changing your residency so that it's not Germany, so that it's not Austria, and change it to Panama, change it to Dubai, change it to any of these territorial tax countries, such that you're not going to be taxed on your worldwide income because you're no longer a resident, right? And so then we get into the conversation of, what are the benefits of a territorial tax country. And to me, I think the big one is that you can live there year round, 365 days a year, be a tax resident and still pay no tax. So that's kind of the difference between residency based and territorial based, right?
Exactly. We could still mention the other two types, the ones that there's really no income tax at all, like you just mentioned for the
Right,
UAE
right,
or
right,
for
right.
Monaco or for like the Bahamas. So it's generally either small islands or very rich like oil rich countries, right? In the Gulf, that's generally where you have no taxes at the no income tax at all. And you also have some countries that have this non-domiciled system, which is a bit, it's similar to the territorial tax system but a bit worse, right? Where the difference is in the territorial tax system, everything that is foreign sourced is tax free. It doesn't matter if you bring it to the country and use it or not. Whereas in these non-dom countries like the UK, Ireland, Cyprus, Malta, Mauritius, Japan, South Korea, some Caribbean countries as well, then your foreign sourced income is tax free as long as it is not brought into or used in the country, right? So if you have dividend income from a company abroad, then it goes to a company like a bank account that you also have abroad, no tax there. If you spend it while traveling abroad, no tax there. But if you use it to cover your life expenses within the country, or if you bring it to a local bank account, then it's in the progressive taxation.
Yeah, because that would be, I guess, considered repatriating the money. Which to me, I wouldn't even do that under a territorial tax system either. Like, I don't think it's a good idea to earn a bunch of money offshore and then bring it into Panama or whatever. Because I think under a territorial tax system that could lead to issues. How do you define the two again as well? Because I think the non-dom one is very underrated and growing. Um, could you just explain sort of what the maybe the key markers or differences are between uh, that make the non-dom system unique?
Yeah, so I would say it's the part about One, the repatriation, right? Like there's not really any tax if you bring the foreign income to the country in a territorial tax country, right? So if you're in Uruguay and you bring in that foreign income, that's not going to have any additional tax. It's the same tax treatment if you keep it abroad or if you bring it in. Whereas in these non-dom countries, if you bring the money in, then it starts being taxed. Or even if you spend it locally, like with a credit card, that officially counts as having brought the money in. So you also have to
Really?
declare it and pay it. The other difference is that territorial tax systems are generally available for everyone, right? In most countries except the Philippines, but in most of these territorial tax countries, it's a system that is also accessible to the locals, right? Like if you're a local and you have foreign income, that's also tax free. Whereas these non-dom countries are exclusively for expats, right? The locals generally cannot access this
Yeah,
non-dom
that's a
system
good point.
only
That's a
if
good
you're a
point.
foreigner. So if you're Japanese and you want to use this non-permanent resident thing in Japan, sorry, it's not going to work.
And this non-dom status, was this invented by the British? Because I know it is pretty big there and famously used by, the Russian billionaires and the Pakistani billionaires who live in London under non-dom status and kind of don't pay tax. Was it inspired by the British? I think you did talk at some point about how this concept has grown in popularity.
Yeah, it's a British tradition. I don't remember exactly the story, but it's something about like the by the time of the where you had the colonial empire from the UK, that you could send your children to the colonies, and then they could keep their foreign income tax free, right? Like the money that they made outside of the country, and not have it taxed. It's something in that manner, right? Where it's still related to the old crown colonies. But nowadays you still have it, right? In the UK, it's the country where it's the most debated, for sure. And that's also something that is it changes between countries, and depending also on the laws, that there's these restrictions where they want to abolish the non-dom system, or they want to restrict it, right? So in the UK, after you live, I think it's 7 years out of the last 10 years, something like this, then you have to start paying like a 30,000 pound lump sum tax every year to keep the system
Mhm.
active. And then after some more years, it goes up to 60,000 pounds. And then after, I think, like 15 years living in the country, then you just lose it altogether. You can't extend it. And you have similar regulations in, for example, Japan or South Korea, where after like 10 years living in the country, then you can't use it anymore, right? So it's also seen as a more temporary thing to grow and not pay tax on your wealth, but eventually you're gonna lose it.
Hmm. I see one version of the future where there comes to be a lot of international pressure on territorial tax countries, because obviously the remote work and digital nomad thing is going to continue to grow, and I think at some point there's just going to be too many people taking advantage of this, and the first thing they're going to do is look at the territorial tax countries, and probably maybe the IMF or something is going to say that everyone needs to do residency based, something like that. But I can see this non-dom thing sort of squeaking under the radar and sort of like getting less heat, or just being sort of like a new way of doing things, because as you said, something from the British tradition that has now become popular, and I think you said Korea, Japan, Cyprus, different places. And so I think there might be a move from the tax-free and territorial tax countries to special economic zones and to non-dom status, and basically just sort of like alternative ways of providing incentives to people that just seem a little bit more politically palatable.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think the best example you can look to is the European Union, right? Because it is a harmonizing entity. They don't want anyone to be having these special regimes, and you have no territorial tax country within the EU, right? No real special economic zones in most of it, but it's also kind of a white pill, like it's a hopeful thing that even within the EU you have so many tax loopholes, right? So in the outermost regions of the EU, you have the two special economic zones in the Canaries and Madeira, but you also have, for example, in Cyprus, where they in Malta, where they have this non-dom regime. You have some countries that they don't tax dividends if they're coming from the EU, for example, like Estonia and Latvia, I think was it. And then you have countries that have these like small company regimes, right? Like in Romania, where you pay 1% tax on your turnover. So that's another way to give some tax incentives. You have countries like Poland and Hungary, which are adding this Estonian taxation model where you don't pay corporate tax until the moment that you distribute the dividends, right? So as long as you keep the money within the company and reinvest it, it's tax free. So it's really nice to see how even within this restrictive environment of the European Union that tries to take away any tax loopholes, you still have a lot of countries finding out different ways to provide tax incentives and be competitive. That's something that actually keeps me very hopeful.
Yeah. And I was thinking we could double click on Portugal for a second since we're talking about Europe. A lot of digital nomads are moving to Portugal right now. It's becoming increasingly popular among Europeans, among Americans. It seems everyone is moving to Portugal. Lisbon's the next big hotspot. So, could you tell us a little bit about what some of the programs are in Portugal, be it the NHR program seems to be extremely popular, and some of the other ways that people could live in Portugal in a tax advantaged way.
For sure. So this is actually another way that these countries find a way to give tax incentives, right? These temporary special programs. So Italy has one, Spain has one, Portugal has one, where for a number of years you get some tax advantages. And in the case of Portugal, for self-employment income and for employment income from a big list of professions, you pay a fixed 20%, which might not sound like the lowest tax, but if you consider that the normal Portuguese pays up to 50% something, it's very advantageous. And you also get 0% tax on some kinds of foreign income, but it's kind of a complicated thing. It's not simply territorial. It has to be from countries that are not in the blacklist, for example, unless they have a tax treaty with Portugal, then it's actually okay. And there must have been the possibility of taxation in the country of origin. So it's something that really depends on the tax treaty between Portugal and that country. So it's something that is way more complicated than just going to a territorial tax country, right? Territorial tax is simple, just open a foreign company, get yourself some dividends, and that's it. Whereas Portugal needs a lot more planning, but you can be tax free on a lot of foreign passive income, right? Like again, dividends, royalties, and interest, and some other kinds of investment income and sale of assets, and some kinds of pensions as well. So you can have 0% tax on a lot of different foreign income sources as long as it's properly planned and structured, and that's going to cost more time and money to plan than just going to territorial tax country. And for the self-employment and the employment income, you have 20% fixed plus social security.
And I think that's just on like locally sourced, right? I think if it's foreign earned salary income and whatnot, I think that is 0%.
Um, in practice, it's gonna be 20%, like almost all of the time. It's They have it 0% if it has been taxed at the other country,
Right.
basically. So if you
Right,
paid,
right, right.
if you're providing services to Germany and it has been taxed there, then Portugal doesn't tax it. But if
Right.
the other
So you
country,
could do like say the Romania thing, pay 1% and then say like, look, Portugal, we are paying something, and then so Portugal will leave you alone.
yeah, so Romania is a company that works while you're in Portugal. So you can have a Romanian company, and then you distribute dividends to yourself in Portugal. There's still going to be some withholding tax on the Romanian side. It's like 5% on dividends. and yeah, then it's going to be tax free in Portugal. But you also have to keep in mind that Portugal, as an EU country, has these restrictions on foreign, like uncontrolled foreign companies, and like these effective management rules, which means that you can't just like open a foreign company that doesn't have any real substance and expect it to not pay taxes in Portugal, right? You have to actually have a local director in the country of incorporation, and you need to have a real office that's not just like a post box or a lawyer's address. So you need to have all of this local substance in the country of incorporation so that Portugal will accept this company as valid, and as so for it, so that it remains legal. And that also has some more administrative costs, right, of keeping this infrastructure, the substance. But in the end, yeah, you can pay 0% tax on the dividends you receive in Portugal.
Right, right. I think the way I think about the Portugal one is you could, if you're already paying taxes somewhere, then you could add the Portugal to your portfolio and it wouldn't add any additional taxes ideally, because they, as long as you're paying somewhere, you can basically just add a Portuguese residency to your, residency portfolio, and Portugal's not going to ask for anything more from you because you're already being taxed like in your home country. That's the way I'm kind of thinking about it. Hopefully that makes sense. Where, like, if you're paying taxes in the States or wherever, even France or something, you could just sort of add like an additional residency in Portugal, kind of be like a double resident or something, and you're probably not going to pay anything extra in Portugal. So that's the one way I thought that it could work out cool. And then you could either sort of live in Portugal or have the ability to now live in Europe, basically tax free, travel all around Europe, due to your Portuguese residency, and you're working towards citizenship in a country where you're not paying any additional taxes. So I think it could work for a lot of sort of like quote unquote normies who are already paying taxes. I think if you're already sophisticated and have like a Dubai or Cayman type setup, maybe it's not the program for you. But I think if you're already paying taxes somewhere, I think you could probably add Portugal and and see benefit from that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's not going to be like completely 0% tax because, for example, if you receive a salary or you're self employed, then there's also the social security costs, right? That's also something that you have to keep in mind. And depending on where your company is, you're going to have to also pay a lot more to have the substance on it. So it's not something that is going to be like, oh, zero extra costs added for being a Portugal tax resident. But I think
Right,
it
but
is a very
let's just say you're like a dentist or something, right? You're a dentist in the U.S. or in Brazil or something. So there's not even a company. I think you can still go get residency in Portugal, and then they'll see that that dentist income is being taxed in Brazil or being taxed locally wherever, and then so Portugal is okay with that. I think, right?
Yeah, on the tax side, yes,
Yeah.
but the you still have social security contributions in Portugal, if I remember correctly, and I think Portugal is a very interesting residency if you either want to spend a lot of time in Europe and you're a nomad, right, and you're going to be traveling around and counting for citizenship, or also if you want to stay there, but like as a maybe as a backup plan B while you're still fully taxable somewhere, and then you also have to pay additional things because of Portugal. Especially if you have a company, right, with this CFC rules, then maybe it doesn't make that much sense. But if you're an employee or self-employed and you already pay tax somewhere, then yeah, as an NHR, Portugal is going to credit that, and you're not going to be double taxed on that.
I think that makes sense for a lot of people because I think if you can set up a plan B in Portugal, hopefully not pay like Social Security or whatever, but just set up a plan B there. You're continuing to live your normal life somewhere else, and just sort of there's very low physical presence requirements. Work towards a passport. Definitely seems to make sense to me.
Yeah, and I think another point about Portugal is just how easy it is to immigrate in the sense of how many immigration options you have, right? For the golden visa, which is the investment one, it is considerably cheaper than going to the UK or Ireland, which are the other English speaking countries in Europe. And you also have the visa for opening a local company, and you have a visa for if you can prove some passive income, and they're also adding a visa now so you can look for a local job even if you want to have if you want to work in Portugal. And they're also creating a digital nomad visa, and they're creating a visa for people from Portuguese speaking countries, and they're just creating visas all the time. Right, so they really are trying to attract as much people as possible.
Hmm. What's it like spending time in Portugal as a Brazilian? I think I remember you had some tweets, kind of making some jokes about kind of about stuff in Portugal because you have spent some time there, right?
Yeah, I stayed I think around 3 months in Cascais, which is like Lisbon region.
Hmm.
And I also got to travel a bit through the country, but living in Cascais mostly. And I mean, it's really nice. The weather is great. I was there in spring, summer, and it's just sunny all the time. That's fantastic if you're looking to sun max. The water is cold, though it's not like you're in the Mediterranean or in a lot of like Caribbean beaches, that kind of thing. It's going to be a Wim Hof cold bathing experience, but it's still really cool. And what else? What else can I mention? As a Brazilian specifically, it's funny because you find Brazilians everywhere. Like I'm walking in Cascais and I hear the Brazilian a Brazilian speaking almost every corner, and like this is a what 200,000 people town, but even there was like 6 Brazilian restaurants and Brazilian food shops. So it's basically like you can get all of the things you like eating and experiencing in Brazil, living in Portugal. So that's why there's also a lot of Brazilians moving there at the moment.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Let's talk a bit about birth tourism, and maybe we could start with birth tourism in Brazil, which I think you said would be one of the best countries to do it.
Absolutely, and I stand firm by this conviction. So, just giving a quick overview, birth tourism is the idea that you have a wife or you have a husband, and you're expecting, and instead of giving birth in your home country, you're going to go to another country to give birth, because in the country you've chosen, they have this jus solis system, which means that a person who is born in that territory is considered a national. They get citizenship by birth. This is in contrast to jus sanguinis countries, where you get the citizenship by being the son of a citizen. Right? It doesn't matter if you're born there or not. This matters if you have this blood connection. So most of Latin America is directly jus solis, right? If you just go and if your son is born there, he's going to automatically be a citizen, with the exception of Chile and Colombia, where you have to actually be the parents have to be resident in the country first so that the child gets automatic citizenship. However, in the case of Chile, if you wait a bit, like if the child waits until they're 18, they then can request the citizenship. So that's the idea of birth tourism, right? And then the child gets the citizenship, and generally, as the parent of a national child, you can immediately get permanent residency, right? Like under these family reunification visas. So that's the main idea. Now, why I consider Brazil to be the best country to do this? Um, you go, you give birth, the child gets the Brazilian citizenship. Then, after 1 year of permanent residency, the parents can also get the Brazilian citizenship. In the case of Mexico and in the case of Argentina, for example, it's 2 years, which is not that long actually for getting a citizenship. It's quite fast. But Brazil is the fastest, right? 1 year, you don't get anything faster than that unless you do a citizenship by investment, right? But then you're investing, over 100K. And the Brazilian passport is, for Latin American standards, I would say the best, because you have the Mercosur bloc in South America, which is basically almost all of South America, with exception of Venezuela and I think like French Guiana is also not part of Mercosur. But for basically all of South America, you have this freedom of movement where, as a Mercosur citizen, you can just go there and request residency, right? Like you don't have to do an investment. You don't have to prove that you have a lot of income. You don't have to make these big bank deposits. No, you can just go there. You're a Mercosur citizen and can request residency, and you don't even need to like translate all the documents, right? And if you go to Uruguay or Paraguay, they accept the Brazilian originals in Portuguese. So that gives you this freedom of movement in an entire continent, basically. This applies also if you do, for example, Argentina or Uruguay or Paraguay, like any of these countries. If you give birth there and you get a Mercosur citizenship, then you have this freedom of movement
Hmm.
in Mercosur.
And I think for the Americans listening, to sort of put this in context, I think Americans are aware that people fly to the U.S. to give birth so that the baby can be American. So we're familiar with birth tourism in the U.S. I think where the distinction or the difference is here is that um, in the U.S. version of birth tourism, where people fly in from China or Mexico or whatever, um, is that the parents do not typically get residency out of it, or at least it's not a straightforward path to becoming a resident just because your kid was born there. So typically, what happens is, the Chinese people, they fly to the US, they have the kid in the US, but then they basically have to go home because there's no path to residency just because the kid was born there. But in Latin America, when your kid is born there, that's enough of a reason to get a residency permit in these countries. And typically it's under a family reunification visa, as you mentioned. So you can basically go to the Brazilian government or the Mexican government, where this also works well, and say, "Hey, my kid was just born in Colombia. My kid was just born in Mexico. My kid was just born in Brazil. I would like to reunify our family, so I'm asking for permanent residency in Brazil so that the family could be together." And they'll give it to you, no problem, right? So I think that's what needs to be understood here.
Yeah, there's some bureaucratic hurdles, right? Latin America overall has some level of bureaucracy,
Hmm.
but you generally get permanent residency right away, so you're immediately on the track to citizenship. And yeah, so like in this entire South American bloc, you get a citizenship there, and you can move to any other country. So that's a lot of freedom of movement you have. And then also Brazil is part of the CPLP, right, which is this community of Portuguese speaking countries, which
Hmm.
last year approved an agreement that they're all going to roll out a CPLP visa, right? So that you, as a citizen of a CPLP country, can move to any CPLP country. And you're already seeing some countries rolling out these visas, right? So Cape Verde already did it, if I remember correctly. Portugal just announced theirs as well. So, as a Brazilian, you have the right to go and move to Cape Verde or Portugal or Angola or Mozambique. Of course, these are not as high ranked countries, except Portugal, that's very high ranked. But it's still, more mobility.
Hmm.
And yeah, but overall I would say like the top passports in LATAM would be Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and also Chile. Don't know if a lot of people know this, but Chile has visa-free access to the United States, right? Like they have the ESTA
Hmm.
approval, which you also don't have in basically all of Latin America. So
Hmm.
that's an interesting one as well. First, you have to get residency there, right, and then your child gets the nationality when they're born. But that's also an interesting one. But then it's 5 years in Chile, if I'm not mistaken. Whereas in Brazil is 1 year, Mexico and Argentina 2 years, Peru is 2 years as well. Then Uruguay is like 3 years, and Paraguay, if I'm not mistaken, is 4 or 3 as well.
So so basically, here's what's going to happen. So I convinced my wife I'm not actually married, but I convinced my wife that we're going to have our baby in Brazil. So we go down there, we fly down, we have our baby in Brazil, we take the baby's birth certificate, and then we give that to our lawyer. They go to the immigration office and they get us permanent residency. And then we're going to wait 1 year with that permanent residency, and after that we can ask for Brazilian citizenship. Here's the thing though, permanent residents in Brazil are being taxed on their worldwide income, right? So how do you sell this program to someone that has a lot of worldwide income and doesn't want to, uh, maybe they want their kid to have Brazilian citizenship, they're down to have it too, but they don't want to get pulled into the Brazil tax net. How can they maneuver this process?
hmm Yeah, you're gonna have to pay some tax in Brazil, but as mentioned, Brazil still has a lot of maneuverability, right? So you can just keep an offshore holding company to hold all your investments, or even just have an offshore company so you can still provide your services abroad. And as long as you don't bring that income to your personal account, right? As long as you don't distribute it to you as an individual and keep it in the corporation or the holding or the trust or whatever, then it's not taxed in Brazil, right? So you don't have to
Okay.
bring your income to Brazil and
And
have
does
it
that have
taxed.
to be a Brazilian company or
No, no,
offshore?
it's an offshore company. Yeah, if you have a Brazilian company, then that also can be attractive. As mentioned, you can pay like between 5 to 15% tax with a Brazilian company, and that's
Okay.
all you're going to pay because when you distribute dividends, they're
Okay. So
not
let's just say
taxable.
you're an American guy, you have an American company, whatever. You just do construction stuff in the US. Um, is that person going to be able to stay out of the Brazil tax net for the most part?
Yeah, so what they earn in their company and that stays in the company is not going to be taxed, right? It's a company providing services to the American market,
Hmm.
and that's okay. And then whatever he brings to his personal accounts, whatever he distributes to himself as an individual, will be taxed in Brazil progressively from
So,
zero
so,
to
and you're talking about, so that, like, say the guy with the construction company in the States, if he pays himself a normal 100K a year salary in the States, is Brazil going to look to tax that, or is Brazil only going to tax what gets brought into Brazil?
No, well, here's where we get into the gray area. Whatever he distributes to something that belongs to him as an individual, right, like a personal account, be it in the States or
Hmm.
Brazil,
Hmm.
then that should be declared as Brazilian income.
Right.
However, I do have an anecdotal evidence of a lot of people that they mostly, like the Brazilian IRS mostly tracks things that are running inside Brazil, right? So if you have a local employment or if you like sell a local home and don't declare it, then you're screwed. But if your income comes from abroad, I know some people who live like 4 years in Brazil and never paid any taxes because they just never declared it. And since their income was foreign, the IRS never noticed them. But
Right.
that's already a gray area. That's not legal. We're not recommending anything illegal here.
Right.
But I do wanted to mention was like you have this foreign company from this American guy, and he's living in Brazil. Let's say he earns, 100K, or let's say like he has a monthly salary, like he earns 10K a month in his company. However,
Hmm.
to live in Brazil, he only really needs like 3K. That's already that gives you a great lifestyle in Brazil. Then he distributes these 3K to himself. That will be taxed progressively up to 27.5% is the maximum rate. So it's going to be probably something like 10, 15, 20% tax in Brazil on that income. But then the rest, the remaining 7K, remains in the company and it's not taxed
Right,
at
right,
all.
right.
And then
Yeah,
when you
so
leave
I guess long
Brazil,
story short, the idea would be, if you're going to do one of these programs in Mexico, which is 2 years of residency, or in Brazil of 1 year residency, I think just what you would do is just sort of make it years where you're not pulling down a lot of personal earned income, and just basically just keep your income in a company somewhere and don't pull it down except for like the bare minimum you need for expenses.
Exactly. So you're going to have 1 year where you're going to pay some tax on what you distribute to yourself to live in Brazil. And then once you get the citizenship, you can just do that declaration of departure that Brazil has. And then boom, you're out of the Brazil tax net. So, that process can also be done in like a day, basically. You just leave Brazil, you provide this, it's kind of like an income tax declaration that you're leaving, and you're no longer in the Brazilian tax net.
Yeah, sorry. Break that down again because I think that's the big question is so you do the year or two in Brazil, you get the Brazilian passport, then how do you get out successfully? Because I think this is underreported is often the difficulty of getting out or just the steps that you need to take by showing proof that you have tax residency elsewhere, things like that.
Yeah, so that is something that you might need in other countries. Luckily, you don't need it in Brazil. So, as a resident of Brazil, if you want to stop being a tax resident, what you have to do is you book a flight somewhere else. You enter the flight, you leave Brazil. Once you're out of Brazil, then you have to hand in this communication of definitive departure, which can be handed in up until February of the next year, which is basically like, just giving your local ID number, saying, "Hey, I left the country." And then you also have to hand in this income tax declaration, which is until April of the following year. And it's a tax declaration from the 1st of January until the date that you said was your departure, like the day you effectively left
Hmm.
the Brazilian territory with definitive intent. And yeah, once you hand the two of them, you're no longer a tax resident in Brazil. You do not have to prove a new tax residency. So that's a good thing. That makes it easy to get in, quick to get the citizenship, and then easy to get out. And it's a good citizenship on top of that. There is one point though, and I would like to point that out for all of birth tourism and not just Brazil. Generally, to naturalize, you need to have knowledge of the local language. So that is a point you have to keep in mind, right? Like if you speak nada of Spanish or nada of Portuguese and you are not really that keen into learning it, then that's probably not for you, because you need to pass this language test, and you need to pass generally like these tests on a bit of the local laws and the local history. So you should have some interest for the country you're doing that, because if you just go
Hmm.
there and you learn nothing of the language, nothing of the culture, nothing of the history, you're generally not going to pass the citizenship tests.
Hmm. And my other concern would be that so 1 year permanent residency and you can apply. Sounds good. But, it's bureaucracy, it's Latin America, uh, it's a naturalization process. After your application is submitted, how long are you waiting to get your naturalization approved, to get your citizenship approved? And I think you technically don't need to stay in the country, or you can I think you technically maybe could give up the tax residency prior to having the passport in hand, to ensure that you're only there for 1 year, but it's still a little tricky, right? They might not look at your application too favorably if they saw that you kind of already left the tax net, right? So I feel like even though on paper it's only 1 year, it could end up being like 2, 3 years, right? While you're waiting to get approved.
Yeah, the citizenship applications does take some months, I think, but it shouldn't be as long, like 3 years, to get naturalized. That's already like kind of a stretch. The It's probably going to be like 1 year plus, like maybe like 1 year and a half, up to 2 years.
Yeah, I'd
Uh,
say realistically, right, you're probably looking at actually like 2 years or like whatever the requirement is. Say it's 1 year in 1 year in Brazil, 2 years in Mexico. I would probably add an additional year of tax residency as like a buffer or as like something to expect while you're basically waiting for your application to process.
yeah, that's very prudent. I would say that, like, even in countries that are more efficient, it can probably take that time for getting the residency and the citizenship approval. Probably the citizenship in most countries is what takes longer, right? In some countries, you can get a residency in a week, but Yeah, I think
But
that's pretty much
here's the best thing
the next thing.
is just to do the birth tourism in a territorial tax country, right? So hopefully that's we and that's a good thread idea for Twitter for you. Um, is birth tourism in zero tax or territorial tax countries? Because then your baby's born there, you're chilling with the baby in Nicaragua or whatever it is, and you're just going to pay zero tax while you're waiting for to while you're passing the time to earn the citizenship. Probably makes more sense, right?
Yeah, that's a good strat idea. Yeah, I mean these countries do take more time to get the citizenship, right? So it's kind of a trade off. Do you want to pay like 1 year of taxes in Brazil, 2 years of taxes in Mexico, maybe even extra year in that, or do you want to pay like 5 years in a place like Nicaragua? I think it's 5 years for
Hmm.
foreigners there.
Right, but they'll still have low physical presence requirements, hopefully. So it's kind of a mix of those factors, I guess. So it's like physical presence, because in Mexico you got to be there 18 of the 24 months. I'm not sure if Brazil has physical presence in that 1 year.
Yeah, you should spend most of the year in Brazil. That
Hmm.
is a point.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So cool. So birth tourism, very very fun topic. Could definitely do whole episodes just on that. Um, what about your personal internationalization setup, Francisco? Don't feel obliged to give away anything that you don't make public normally. But how are you thinking about internationalization for yourself? So you have Brazilian passport, you have an Austrian passport. What are some of the things that make the most sense for you? Are you still a Brazilian resident?
I'm no longer a Brazilian resident for I think 2 years now. I did the permanent leave. The In terms of citizenship, I'm pretty fine with where I am. Right, I have an European citizenship. I have a South American citizenship. It already covers pretty much everything I could want. And even if I wanted another citizenship, Austria is very restrictive on getting new citizenships. You have to like first
Hmm.
ask permission, and they almost never give it. So I'm gonna just stick with what I have. In terms of company structures, Settee is currently established in Estonia. And Estonia is a very interesting jurisdiction because it is one place where you can be tax free while doing business in the EU. Because when you distribute dividends, then there's 20% tax at the moment of the distribution. But they allow you to take out a salary which is not taxable in Estonia. It's only taxable in your country of residency. At the moment, I do not have a country of tax residency. So I take out these salaries and I don't have to pay tax anywhere. That is not a completely long term solution because I do want to get a residency soon. I want to get a residency in Paraguay around January, February. That's probably when I'm going to do the permanent residency there. I'm not going to be a tax resident, so for now it's still okay. But if I were to become a tax resident, then you could have issues with the local salary. So by then I'll probably pivot to something like a Prospera company or even a US LLC.
Okay, gotcha. Um, and another kind of big topic I wanted to discuss that I think goes underreported is some of the opportunities that are available for Latinos and people from Latin American countries. So we talked a bit about the freedom of movement in within Latin America, and so I think this is interesting for some of us that are interested in having a Latin American passport as well, and sort of what are the benefits of having that. But so you talked about how a Brazilian can move to any country in South America. So a Brazilian can just take a flight to Colombia and ask for residency, become a Colombian resident, and then they have maybe, I think, like a 2 year path to citizenship in Colombia.
It's
And I
actually
think
1 year.
one
It's
year.
really easy. Yeah, you have a lot
And
of
so
these
all
Latin
the
American.
Latin American people can basically like move to each other's countries, and they have very fast paths to citizenship, like typically 1 or 2 years. It's pretty crazy, right? Because you could just keep popping around or do multiple at once and have a lot of Latin American citizenships real quick.
Yeah, that is something that you have. So in South America, we have this mobility. Within Central America, you also have the like a,
CA4.
yeah, that's that economic bloc that has some more benefits from people within from these countries. You also have in the Caribbean, CARICOM. So you have like a lot of these regional blocks, kind of. And you also have these naturalization, like sped up naturalization procedures in Latin America for people who are originally from Latin America. So, for example, Panama is very interesting in this regard. If you're a Latin American or Spanish, I believe, if it takes the time to naturalize that a Panamanian would take in your country. So, for example, it takes a Panamanian 4 years to naturalize in Brazil, then it takes 4 years for Brazilian to naturalize in Panama. 2 years in
Mhm.
Argentina, then 2 years for an Argentinian in Panama. So that's also a very interesting system. And like a lot of the Central American countries have the same thing. And another interesting fact is that Spain has the same rule, right? If you're Latin American, you can get citizenship in Spain with 2 years of residency. So that is the fastest
Yeah.
European citizenship by far, but you have to be Latin American or from Portugal or Equatorial Guinea, like former Spanish colonies and so on.
Yeah, I was going to take it there how people from any Latin American country can go to, I think they can even go to Portugal. It's sort of like an Iberian Peninsula thing, right? Where, yeah, it's just a very fast path to residency. And I look at that and I'm like, why are any Latinos in their country of origin? Because you can either go to Europe and become a citizen in like 2 years, or you could just go to Colombia or somewhere else in Latin America and again become a citizen in 1 or 2 years. They just have, and then they just have all these opportunities. It seems crazy to me.
Yeah, I think it's partially one because of lack of money, right? It does take some money to do to get an international flight and move abroad and do all of that relocation thing and get the residence permits and all that in Europe. A lot of people still don't have that financial opportunity, but a lot of people also don't have the knowledge of these opportunities, and that's something we're
Hmm.
trying to help fix, right?
Exactly.
A lot of them don't know that you could naturalize in 2 years in Europe.
Right, and I think it's these tweets and stuff that we're doing that says, "Are you from Latin America? You can become Spanish in 2 years." You know what I mean, and all that. And so, um, and it could even work. I think the rule that I've really seen is that if you're a naturalized citizen of these countries, that you don't get the same benefits. What I mean by that is, so say a gringo like myself, we go down, we get Colombian citizenship or whatever, um, we can't then go to other Latin American countries, or we can't then go to Spain and say, "Oh, hey, I'm Latino. I get citizenship in 2 years." I think it doesn't work like that. However, if you have your kids in Latin America, or I think even if just your kids have a Latin American passport, then they can take advantage of this, right? Because they'll be sort of born with that passport. They didn't naturalize, they were born with it. And then I think even if they weren't born there, right? So let's just say I have a couple Latin American passports. Let's just say I have a Mexican passport. And let's just say I pass that to my kid, even if he was born in Canada or Europe or whatever. He's Mexican at birth.
Yeah.
And so, even though he wasn't born in Mexico, he wasn't born in Latin America, he's Mexican at birth, he's considered Latino, and then he could have those benefits of 1 year to citizenship in Latin America, 2 years to citizenship in Spain, 2 years to citizenship in Portugal, right? So, I think that's an extremely underreported benefit.
Yeah, for sure. That is something that I'm still trying to get more anecdotal evidence of, like people who, got a citizenship in Latin America, and then try to do it in Spain or try to do that thing in other Latin American countries. Because generally, I think in the legislation it does say something like that you have it by birth, or that you're a
And
natural of
yeah,
that
natural
country, not
born.
just a citizen. But it's worth a try, right? Like if you go there with a citizenship certificate and you're speaking fluent Spanish, maybe they let you through. It's worth trying.
Or you could do like a two step. And so let's just say you're a gringo like me. First, I get citizenship in Mexico, and then I get another citizenship in Latin America, kind of, and I put like Mexico on those documents or something. And so maybe it could sort of like obscure the fact that I was even born in Canada or the United States, right? And then you could take that second Latin American one and take that to Spain or something, and be like, oh yeah, I'm I'm Latino, like I was Mexican and then Colombian. I don't know. That's a little far fetched, um, but yeah, I mean, as a Latino, definitely a lot of options because you have all these territorial tax countries in your backyard. You have quick paths to citizenship in other Latin American countries, and a quick path to citizenship in the Iberian Peninsula as well. And I think it works both ways as well. So I think people from the Iberian Peninsula also have a quicker path to citizenship in almost every Latin American country.
Yeah, generally you have if you're a Spaniard, you can get faster citizenship in all of these Spanish-speaking countries, and
Hmm.
also like if you're from a Portuguese-speaking country, you can get citizenship in Brazil in 1 year, right? So if you're a Portuguese who's listening to this, come to Brazil.
So if someone did the NHR, you think so? Someone does the Portugal NHR, they get Portuguese citizenship. Do you think that they could then take that new Portuguese citizenship and get quicker access to Brazilian citizenship?
From what I talked to our Brazilian lawyers, the understanding of the law is you have to be a national from like originally from that country. So
Hmm.
it shouldn't work. But I mean, it's actually faster if you just do Brazil directly, right? Than do Portugal then Brazil. But I don't think that would work. You could try it out, but at least from what I got from our local lawyers, it shouldn't be possible.
Yeah. And then let's talk a little bit about Paraguay and Uruguay, which, because we've been kind of talking about South America a lot. And it seems like those, and I guess Ecuador, are the three main options in South America for having a higher degree of personal freedom, for lowering your taxes, for getting some aspects of a territorial tax system. I looked into Uruguay a lot, partly using your information, and it seemed like Uruguay doesn't really work for a lot of digital nomad types, um, but maybe it works for like more high level entrepreneurs. Um, but then Paraguay is like super good. But yeah, I was just hoping that maybe you could kind of talk about what are the options for people in South America.
Sure. So regarding Uruguay, Paraguay, this conundrum, Paraguay is easier to get permanent residency, right? You just have to deposit like 35 million guaranis, I think, which is around 5K USD in a bank. Then once you get the residence permit, you can take it out. So it's you don't really need to do permanent investment there. It's just during the processing time. And then the residence permit is valid for 10 years, right? So it's something very, very flexible. You don't really have to keep a residence in the country. Like you can even, after you do the procedure, you can leave and then you can have someone ship you your cedula. So it's super flexible, right? But in terms of living there, I've only been to Ciudad del Este for like 1 day, so I don't really have that much personal experience. But from anecdotal evidence, it gets quite boring after some time. It's not really the most developed country, like in terms of traffic and amenities, and just overall quality of life. It's probably not the country you want to stay in for like years and years and years, unless you're something like a homesteader. You want to have your farm and your personal freedom and that kind of thing. Then you can get a lot of farmland and some
By
guns
the way,
and
your English is so good. Homesteader? What Brazilian knows that term? Where did you learn English, by the way?
uh, I mean, partially work. Partially, my dad also spoke English with me a lot. He used to do a lot of like international traveling for his work, and he would try to get me to speak that as well. So
And
kudos
so
to
you
you,
you
dad.
you speak German fluently as well?
Yeah. I lived in Austria for 4 years, and my grandpa is Austrian as well. So he had a lot of German books at home. And where I come from in Brazil, actually, the city is called Blumenau, and you have some other German-speaking cities there. Like you
Uh-huh.
can have German in school, right? I had it for 9 years in elementary school.
Did you? Okay, cool.
So,
Sorry, just a little aside there. But yeah, but with the Paraguay thing, but there's basically no physical presence requirements. So I think that's another very common misconception because you can get Paraguayan permanent residency, and then you only have to visit like once every 3 years for a day. So very easy to maintain. So I think we're doing a good job online of sort of dispelling the notion that a permanent residency or a citizenship needs to be the place that you live, and that we're sort of educating people on the fact that it's possible to have multiple permanent residencies. You could even have 10 permanent residencies, and you don't necessarily have to live there. But it's a good thing to have basically as a plan B at very least, and it can work into different aspects of your plan. And uh, and yeah, so
Yeah.
that's important to mention, right?
Yeah, it can give you a lot of benefits, right? When you're a permanent resident, you can, for example, get a local bank account or these kinds of things that generally are harder if you're a tourist, or you have worse conditions as a tourist. You can get like a driver's license. You can also get a tax ID, tax certificate, in
Hmm.
case any country wants to try to say, yeah, you should actually pay taxes here. Then you can actually fall back on a country to defend you. Like to show, no, I'm already a tax resident of Paraguay. But if you don't have no tax residency and someone tries to tax you, then you have no recourse.
So what do you see for your plans with Paraguay?
I mean, Paraguay has the fact that you don't have to spend basically any time there is really good for me. So I want to get it. From there, you can also use it to get some exchanges and bank accounts and cards. So for example, you can get a Kraken or a Binance crypto account verified if you're a Paraguayan resident. And Claro Paraguay, just like Claro Uruguay, has a really nice SIM card which works everywhere in the Americas and the Caribbean and in most of Europe. And it's you get pretty good internet. You pay like $12 a month, and you have like almost 20 gigabytes of roaming. So it's I've been using the one from Claro Uruguay, and then when I get the Paraguayan residency, I'm gonna switch over to Claro Paraguay, which is even cheaper than the Claro Uruguay one.
Nice. That's a good thing to have because that's a good way of building a tie. And if you ever want to apply for citizenship, you can sort of show that the phone bill history, and that'll count as a tie. So that'll help your application.
Yep, another point of connection. That's something that Uruguay is more strict, right? Like Uruguay is gets a lot more attention from Brazilians as well because it's one of the stablest, least corrupt, more developed. Overall, like you look at all the indices, like safety and HDI and lower inequality. All of this, Uruguay is at the top of South America and Latin America in general, along with Chile. And Uruguay also has a lot of freedom. So, I remember going to an Airbnb in Montevideo, and then I go to the rooftop and I see like six plants of weed, which is something that in Brazil, you could get arrested for, but there they're just growing it on the rooftops.
Wow.
It's also the most armed country in the Americas. I think it's also like seventh most armed country in the world. You have like 30 something guns per every 100 civilians.
Uruguay.
Yeah,
I
it's
did not
actually
know that.
pretty easy to get a gun there. You can get like up to 3 guns just claiming that you want to be able to protect yourself. So, that's also pretty nice if you're a resident there and you want to be able to protect your farmland. Um, yeah, but you have more presence requirements, right? You have to be there at least once a year to keep the residency active. And during the like if you're South American, you can just ask for a permanent residency right away. But if not, then you have to get the permanent residency first. And during this time, you actually have to be spending a lot of time in the country. And then once you have the permanent residency, you have to stay there one day every year. So it has a lot more presence requirements, but it can still be tax free for a lot of people. So on the tax side, both countries are very interesting. But on the, if you're a traveler, a nomad, then Paraguay is going to put less restrictions on yourself.
Do you see yourself doing something with Uruguay, or does it line up with your personal plans?
Yeah. Like Uruguay, I really liked being in Montevideo. It was I spent there like 2 weeks, but I really liked the city overall. A lot of parks and a lot of trees and beaches and nice historical centers. So overall, I think if I were to have like a base, if I think it's a good place to create a base to just like settle down and work. It's very close to Argentina and South Brazil, which is where I have most of my friends and family. So for me personally, I think it's a nice place to have as a base. But at the moment, I still want to travel more. I still want to, I've only been to Uruguay and Brazil and Latin America, so I want to get to know more of it before I create, ties in any given country. So maybe at some point, like 2 years, 3 years. But for now, I'll just get the Paraguayan one and travel a lot more.
Yeah, definitely. I think the Paraguay one's a good idea. And then the Uruguay, I mean, that's an easy drive for you too, right? You could just drive down from Florianopolis.
Yeah, you even have buses from I think even Buenos Aires, then gets the ferry, and then it goes all through Uruguay until Santa Catarina. So if you live in South Brazil, it's very convenient, and Paraguay is also quite convenient. Like I have family in Paraná, which is the state bordering Paraguay. So for me, it would be like a 5 hour, 6 hour drive to Ciudad del Este.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. Dude, I think we've dropped a lot of knowledge bombs on this episode for sure. I think this has been an interesting one. I'm consistently impressed by how much you know for being a young guy. Because you're what? You're like 23 years old or something?
Soon 23, yeah. For now, 22.
Crazy, man. I can't wait to see where you're gonna be when you're 32, when you're 42. I think we got a future Brazilian billionaire on our hands here.
Oh, as we say in Portuguese, Deus te ouça, like God hear you.
Vai com Deus.
Thanks, man. Thanks for the invite. This was a really great talk. Great to be here.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, dude. Like I said, I think you have so much potential. Really looking forward to working together in the future and sort of seeing ways that we can help people kind of expand their options in Latin America, create a plan B, and sort of demystify all these different systems. So, thank you for all the writings and information that you've put out there, helping to demystify things. And it's been really interesting to watch.
Thank you, Vance. Yeah, let's keep working on that.
Awesome. So, where can people find you and learn more about what you're up to, Francisco?
Yeah, so they can check out Settee.io. That's the company in Portuguese. So if you're a Brazilian and you want to move out, that would be the company. But if you don't speak Portuguese, if you don't speak English, then you should check out Staatenlos .ch. That's the one in English and German. So that's our international branch. And if you book a consulting there in English, then I might be doing that consulting for you as well.
Awesome. Francisco, thank you so much for your time today. This was an awesome conversation and all the best.
Thanks, man. Same. Have a great week.